Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and I'm really excited about this week's special guest. And I know I always get excited, but I've just been talking to him beforehand, and there's so much we could talk about. His name is Yaron Brook. He is the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, and the reason I sort of got to hear that he would be a good thing is that he came to talk at my son's school and my daughter's school.
Yep.
And I got really good feedback that you caused a real stir, Yaron.
I always cause a stir. So there's the feedback I get afterwards is always the kids don't stop talking about it. For weeks later, there's debate and discussion going on among the kids, and that's what you want to do. I mean, what are we in the business of doing? We're in the business of trying to get people to think for themselves, and to think a little bit outside of the box. And I think what happens when I go to these high schools, and I've been touring for the last couple of years, touring British high schools, is they've never heard what I have to say. They've never heard this position. They've never heard my views on history, or my views on economics, or my views on politics, or my views on ethics and morality. And it really creates cognitive dissonance, which is a truly beautiful thing, because it forces them to think, and whether they agree with me or not, it gets them thinking.
So give me a potted version of what you're saying to these kids.
So it varies from school to school, but mostly I'm saying, look, capitalism is this amazing success story. It's just you can't look at the data and not see how wonderful capitalism is. You can't travel around the world and see different countries and not identify that capitalism is the greatest thing that's happened to mankind. Really, if you, from a material perspective, we are so rich today. They can't imagine. I tell them a story of 300 years ago, 95+% of humanity lived on $2 a day or less. And they don't know that. They don't know that before the Industrial Revolution, we were all dirt poor. All of us were dirt poor, a few aristocrats and the rest of us. And then I say, well, but this is the real challenge, particularly for people like me and maybe for you. Why then, if it's such a success story, and it clearly is, there's just no question about it, and that they take as a shock. How can he defend capitalism even like that? Why is it that everybody hates it? Why is it so despised? Why is socialism so popular? Why is statism in any form so popular if capitalism is so despised? And I lead from that into a discussion of morality, because my claim is, Ayn Rand's claim was, that really what drives our infatuation with statism and socialism and communism and any form of collectivism is not the success story, because there is no success story. It's a moral identification. We are raised with a particular morality that drives us towards collectivism, that drives us towards being taken care of by the state. The morality of otherism or altruism, not in the common usage of the word, but the idea that the purpose of life is to live for others. Well, if the purpose of life is to live for others, it means others are more important than you. If others are more important than you, then the group out there is more important than you, and there you have collectivism. It's pretty straightforward. And then I talk about the alternative, which I think is the only way we can defend capitalism, and that is to establish an individualistic moral code, a moral code based on kind of Aristotle's view of eudaimonia, of virtue achieving individual human flourishing. And I do all of that, and I cover that. I've got the shtick, I've got it down. I've got good stories, I've got good jokes in the middle, and they're intrigued by the capitalism story. They're intrigued by the moral story. They're really intrigued by the whole thing. Nothing that I say there have they ever heard before.
Yes. Now, isn't that scary?
It's very scary. It's very scary, particularly the history. And I did an event last night with Douglas Murray, and there were some interesting questions afterwards. And one of the things I said was, somebody says, isn't it too bad that our kids don't learn about the evils of socialism? I said, yeah, that's bad. But what's really horrible is that our kids don't learn about the beauty of the Industrial Revolution. I said, all they learn is about from the lens of Dickens. That's what they know about the Industrial Revolution. Child labor, and it was horrible, and there was coal, and it was dirty and filthy. But what they don't learn is about the doubling of life expectancy, or almost doubling. What they don't learn is how we became rich from poverty. What they don't learn is that capitalism It's that century and its capitalism that freed the slaves, that its slavery disappeared during the 19th century, during this industrial revolution. And that's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. They don't learn about even emancipation of women is a direct consequence of the attitude of capitalism, the idea of individualism, the idea that drives the capitalist mentality, all these beautiful things. And primarily the wealth and technology they so adore today, right? The iPhones or whatever. All products of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, and yet all they know about it are negatives.
Totally.
That's scary.
I don't know whether you're aware of this. There is this famous the opening show of the London Olympics. They had this sort of tableau vivant of English or British history presented for the nation, and needless to say, the high points of history were the NHS, the National Health Service, this kind of socialist rationing system. And when the director of this show, Danny Boyle, who was the film director, made some good movies, Train Spotting and stuff. He when he portrayed the Industrial Revolution, he showed these dark satanic mills, these chimneys erupting like sort of menacing phalluses through the green and pleasant land that England was, where presumably Strephon and Chloe frolicked, playing their pastoral pipes and stuff.
And of course, I always ask the audiences, what do you think children did before the Industrial Revolution? And a few people say, well, yeah, they worked. I said, yeah, well, children have worked since the beginning of time. They've always worked, because if they don't work, they starve. And if they starve, they die. But more than working, what did children really do before the Industrial Revolution? And the answer is they died. Fewer than 50% of kids made it to age 10 before the Industrial Revolution. How many kids today die before age 10? Almost none. Why is that? How did that happen? It's a consequence of the wealth created during the Industrial Revolution. And people say medicine. Well, where did medicine come from? The same process that led to the industrialization, the same process that created the wealth, also allowed us now to build hospitals, also allowed people to specialize in profession of doctors, also allowed for all the medical research that all requires capital, that all requires money. And of course, the scientific method is what led to both. The scientific method is a product of the veneration of reason, and which led to both capitalism and medical advances. It's all one story, and for them to take what they want out of the story and to forget the other parts is horrible. So yes, children came into the cities, into London, and worked in factories during the 19th century. Their life expectancy increased. It wasn't pleasant, but it's not clear that it was worse than working in the farm from sun up to sunrise and barely eating. And within a few decades, parents were making enough money that they could take their kids out of the factories and put them in schools. People think government did that. But government only steps in and passes laws against child labor after there's almost no child labor anyway.
Yes, you've got metrics for that, have you?
Yes, absolutely. There's data on this. And it's not just in England. If you look at the third world today, you see the countries that are passing laws against child labor. They always do it at about the same GDP per capita, because at that point, parents are rich enough to be able to feed their kids without the kids working.
Isn't it the same as well to do with things like female emancipation and all the laws or the race laws in America? Wasn't integration already happening and on both fronts before?
Well, it was certainly before the Civil War.
I was thinking later legislation.
Yes, in the so if you look at the 1940s and 50s, integration was happening, particularly in the North, and indeed blacks from the South were leaving the South and going to the North, starting in the 19-teens all the way through the 1950s and 60s. They were leaving because of discrimination, because of Jim Crow laws, and indeed the data suggests that more blacks were entering the middle class before the Civil Rights Act, and primarily before affirmative action and before all these reverse discrimination, and I'd say particularly before the establishment of the welfare state, which was in the 1960s, blacks were entering the middle class much faster then than they are today. The reason I think blacks that halted the entrance into the middle class is welfare. If welfare institutionalizes into poverty, welfare tells you that you're not good enough to make it by yourself and you need the state to help you. So welfare, the biggest victims of welfare are the recipients.
Yeah.
I'm offended by the fact that my money is stolen without my asking to redistribute to other people. But what really offends me is what we do to poor people and how we institutionalize them into poverty by writing them a check and giving them, unconditional funds to live. It takes away their incentive to work. And if you take away somebody's incentive to work, you reduce their lifestyle immediately. But more importantly, you reduce something that I think is more important than work, than the money, which is their self-esteem. Much of our self-knowledge, much of our self-esteem, much of our confidence in life comes from putting bread on the table, from feeding our family, from achieving things, from having goals and achieving them. And if you don't, and we get that mostly from our work. I think everybody does, whatever profession, you push, you strive, and you get that confidence. Yes, I can do it. You take away work from somebody, you destroy their capacity to live.
So, where are you on Trump? You must be quite a fan.
No, I'm not.
No, you're not.
Quite a critic.
But in terms of what he, compared with Obama, what he's achieved.
Well, I mean, these comparisons are hard because I worry about the long-term consequences of a Trump administration. Policy by policy, sure, we can find a lot of good policies that he has implemented. But he is crass and vulgar and authoritarian in his nature, has no understanding of the American Constitution or the American system of government, is impatient with the separation of powers and would love to get rid of that. Now, he can't do anything about it because I don't think he's that smart, and because we have a system of government that's pretty solid and protects itself. I worry about where this trend, though, right? So if he is the first in a line, and Obama was to some extent also, definitely had authoritarian tendencies. But with Trump, it's more, and what really scares me about Trump are the people who blindly support him, because they are exhibiting real authoritarian tendencies, right? So they will support him whether he does good things or bad things. So so tariffs, which I think is like one of the dumbest strategies in the world. People who supposedly a free market will support it because it's Trump, no matter what he does. So I think he's revealed something in the American psyche, something in the American politics, which is very ugly and very scary, and so I fear for what happens. Even if there's a backlash from the left, which could be scary, or if there's no backlash from the left and people become more and more enamored with him, then it's also scary in terms of where the right is heading. So, and then we could take apart his policies, policy by policy. I think the good stuff he does is mainly by accident, and he does a lot of bad. So just a quick one. Everybody compliments him on tax cuts. I'm always for tax cuts. Never seen a tax cut I don't like. But as an economist, I have to say tax cuts are useless if you don't cut spending.
Right. Yes.
I think spending is higher than under Obama, except for his stimulus package in the early days.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. But in terms of the welfare damage, that was done a long time ago. Was it LBJ? Or?
Yes, it's all LBJ in the 60s.
So the Great Society was about the worst thing that ever happened to America.
Well, yes. I mean, I think it really gets going with FDR. I think of course the
yeah, you've had some socialists, haven't you, running your country?
Yeah.
My goodness.
I mean, even before FDR, if you think about President Wilson, a real progressive, the first real progressive who was president of the U.S., we got an income tax. Before Wilson, it was deemed unconstitutional. They literally had to change the Constitution to add an income tax, which it did in 1914. We got the Federal Reserve, which I consider abomination, and we got World War I, which I still don't quite understand why the U.S. got involved in, and why I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of Americans died for what exactly. You Brits, Germans, and French were killing each other quite well without the Americans having to intervene and get themselves killed. And we got the League of Nations. There's another abomination. So
yes.
All of that under President Wilson. So he really, and I don't particularly like Teddy Roosevelt. So if you start with Teddy and then go to Wilson and then go to FDR, and then I think you get the full manifestation in LBJ in the 1960s. And then, of course, Nixon was quite bad if you really look at his policies, from establishing most of the environmental regulation that we suffer from in the United States today is under Nixon. I don't know, he did price controls. He did all kinds of funny things that you would never expect from a Republican to do. He tried all kinds of statist policies to try to address the economy. and failed. So it's been a long string of bad presidents. The last president I like is Calvin Coolidge.
I thought you were going. I knew everyone.
He's not my favorite, but he's the last one I liked.
Okay, it's cool. Everyone says Coolidge. Everyone who knows anything about.
Well, it's early 20s, and there was a recession, and he did nothing.
Yeah, and it healed itself.
And it healed itself.
Economy
very
healed
quickly.
thyself.
Very, very quickly.
Whereas
I've got a whole theory about the 2008 crisis and what would have happened if Paulson and Bernanke had chosen to do nothing.
Oh, tell me.
And I think it would have been much better. I think if Bear Stearns would have been allowed to go bankrupt in March of 2008, early, Lehman Brothers would have had to shape up. Lehman Brothers would have never gone bust. The U.S. economy would have gone into recession a little earlier, maybe in March, but it would have healed itself very quickly. I think a lot of what happened in the financial crisis in September and October of 2008, exactly 10 years ago, was panic as a result of the fact that markets realized, that you had people leading the country who didn't know what they were doing, who had no clue what they were doing. Paulson goes out to the press and to the American public and says, unless Congress gives me $700 billion to do with as I please, talk about authoritarianism, right? As I please, the world might end.
Yeah.
He said this. And so what are markets supposed to do? Markets are supposed to, wait a second, the Treasury Secretary is panicking. We should probably panic too. Paul Bernanke, if you look, he's written a book, so everybody thinks he's a hero. He saved the economy. But actually, you look at Bernanke. I did this. You take his commentary from summer of 2007 to summer of 2008, and you just take the comments he made about the economy. He was wrong on everything that he said. Housing can't cause a recession. Freddie and Fannie are fine. The banks are all in great shape. Don't worry. All of these things he's saying for 12 months that turn out to be absolutely wrong. What are markets supposed to do? The Federal Reserve doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the panic, a lot of the damage done to financial markets was done because of the incompetence of these people.
Where do you think in your alternative history would please say no. Would Goldman Sachs be still with us?
You know, I'm not quite as negative at Goldman Sachs as many people are. The thing I hate most about Goldman Sachs, the thing I hate most about them, is that they have provided every Treasury Secretary in a long, long time. And there's no question in my mind that Paulson didn't mind letting Lehman Brothers go bankrupt because Lehman was the competition. And he was the former chairman of Goldman, and Goldman and Lehman have always been competitive, although Goldman's always been better, so they've always viewed Lehman as insignificant. If Goldman had been on the brink of bankruptcy, there's no question in my mind he would have bailed them out. But that's the kind of cronyism that exists in the world. But I know people who work at Goldman. I understand Goldman's business model, and on a day-to-day basis, what Goldman Sachs does is good for the economy. It's good for the world. It's the cronyism, and it's the rotating door with the Treasury that is horrific.
But isn't that a bit like
disastrous.
saying I really love the way the trains ran on time in Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. I mean,
well, but the question is, who do you blame? Do you blame Hitler or do you blame the trains? And what I do is so when I look at Goldman Sachs, what I blame is government. So I don't blame. For the most part, I don't blame business for being crony because I don't think they have a choice. I blame government for having power over business and therefore necessitating the cronyism. My favorite example here is Microsoft, right? So Microsoft in the 1990s was the largest company in the world by market cap and most successful and dynamic and growing and innovative. And this is from a guy who's always used Apple. I used to hate Microsoft, but those are the facts. And they were invited to Congress because in spite of all their success and the billions they had made and the billions Bill Gates had made, they were spending exactly $0 on lobbying. They didn't lobby. So they were invited to in front of Congress, just like, what's his name, Zuckerberg had been recently. And the head of the committee was Orrin Hatch from Utah, a Republican, young. He was young back then. And he literally stood up and yelled at them. You have got to start spending money in Washington, D.C. You have got to hire lawyers. You have got to start lobbying. And I want to see a building here in Washington, D.C. You should have a headquarters here. In other words, you should bribe me, right? This is a Republican. He basically is telling Microsoft, you should bribe me. And this is all well documented. And Microsoft basically said at the meeting, he said, look, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. We're not interested. We've got nothing to gain in Washington. We're doing our thing. We're producing great products. We're the biggest company in the world. What do we need you for? We don't need politicians. You guys are just a waste of time. And they left. And they went back to Seattle. And 6 months later, the knock on the door at Microsoft headquarters, we're from the Justice Department. And we're here to go after you for antitrust. All right? What did they do? What was the evil that Microsoft did with regard to antitrust? They offered a product for free. It was called the Internet Explorer, and Netscape had complained to the Justice Department. So the lesson learned is you have to play the game. If you don't play the game, we're going to go after you. I mean, look at Google today. Google has never gotten in trouble with antitrust. And you have to say, wait a minute, Google? I mean, I don't believe in antitrust laws, but given the laws that exist, Google should be on their radar. Why has Google never been in trouble? Because from day one, Google has spread the money around, has spent money in Washington. They haven't spent enough in Brussels, obviously, because they get in trouble in Brussels. But so Microsoft today spends tens of millions of dollars in Washington on lobbying. It has a beautiful building right in the middle of D.C., equal distance from the White House and the House of Representatives. Gorgeous glass building right behind the Cato Institute, funnily enough. And they've learned their lesson. You have to play the game. And to play the game, you have to be in Washington. So when I see bankers lobby Washington, it's like, well, what are they supposed to... Goldman Sachs has 7 different regulatory agencies that regulate it. I don't know the number for Goldman Sachs, but I can give you the number for J.P. Morgan. At J.P. Morgan, every day, over 150 government employees go to work at the J.P. Morgan building. They have offices at J.P. Morgan, monitoring and supervising and signing off on every single thing J.P. Morgan does. There are no private banks in the United States. They've all been nationalized. They're like public utilities where, pretend you're private, but the government controls everything.
Whoa. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Yaron Brook. More in a moment.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson.
Everything in hip-hop is not bad. Kanye agreed with us, so let's love him today until he raps tomorrow and you turn your back. Because if you jump off when the fun of the moment is over, then you are in fact making Kanye the token he is accused of being. So please, don't do that. Don't go there.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson. Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Yaron Brook, who is the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute. So, what are we going to do about this? Well, I mean, I know it's a big question, but my jaw was hitting the floor when you described this 150 people going to the mall. And crony capitalism is one of my bugbears too.
Well, I hate calling it, if I can, I hate calling it crony capitalism. There's no something capitalism. Cronyism is a feature of statism. Crony is a feature of the lack of capitalism. Under capitalism, there is no cronyism by definition, because capitalism is, in my view, the separation of state from economics. So the state has no power over business, and therefore business doesn't lobby. Cronyism only exists as government grows and controls the economy more and more. So cronyism is a feature of statism. I mean, the most crony system in the world is socialism, where everything's integrated, right? The government and business is completely integrated. So I don't like conscious capitalism. I don't like, enlightened capitalism or any There's capitalism. Capitalism is the system that protects individual rights. It protects us as individuals and otherwise leaves us alone, leaves the economy alone, separates state from economics. There's no something capitalism. Okay, but yeah, I agree with you. Cronyism is a major, major problem in the world in which we live today.
Yeah.
And it's a product of the mixed economy, of too much government.
Because I'm thinking, look, here you are, you're doing the Lord's work. You are parachuting into schools like my kids' schools, and you're basically red pilling the kids.
Yes.
And if only their teachers did it, which they're not doing at all.
No, opposite. No, teachers are doing damage. It's not that the teachers tend to be, at least in the United States, they tend to be way on the left in the political spectrum and in philosophical spectrum, and they're teaching the exact opposite. They're training these kids to be good socialists. They're training these kids to be good collectivists. They're training these kids to ultimately for authoritarianism, and they're giving them false history. It's not just that they don't teach history; they give them false sense of history, and so these kids come out of school not really knowing anything about the real world. And in America, which is different than England, England's actually much better. In America, we don't teach kids to think. So they don't know how to be critical thinkers. They don't know how to ask the right questions. My impression is that the English school system is much better.
But hang on a second. Are you talking about, you mainly go to private schools, don't you?
Well, here in England, yes.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing.
Yes.
So you've got kids who have probably got slightly better teaching. I mean, we do have good new schools cropping up.
But I'd say even in America, even the private schools are not very good.
Are they not?
No, I mean the private school I send my kids to for high school was more left than the public school.
I'm afraid this is the case in the UK as well now. Increasingly, you get these lefty teachers who think they kind of want to undermine the institutions that they're being paid lots of money to work for.
Yes.
And they kind of resent on some level. I mean, not all of them. You get some great teachers, but I'm quite shocked sometimes at parents' evening when I realise just what bunch of lefties I'm dealing with.
It's unbelievable. I mean, I've been impressed, I have to say. I've been impressed in England with the quality of the kids.
You get good questions.
I'm going to the best schools, granted, but I'm getting great questions, real engagement, real. You can tell in their eyes that this is interesting. They might not agree with me, but they have the confidence to challenge me, which is great. I get in the U.S. kids tend to be way too passive and way less intelligent.
I've found that. Whenever I've spoken to American college kids, even they are just. It's like talking to. I might as well be addressing a herd of cattle, actually, for all the interaction I get.
That occurs a lot. Although I have to say, there are countries in the world where it's worse. Like Scandinavia is pretty bad, and
really?
But the worst place in the U.S. is if you go to the Midwest, where they have no expressions, and it's very tough to get them to express themselves and to get them to actually engage. But the American educational system, with exception of the sciences and engineering, is pathetic. It's really, really, really awful. Now, my impression is of British kids is that they're smarter. Now, it might be the accent.
Yes, we ask now.
Yeah, because the accent adds IQ points immediately.
I'll take that. That's good. And what are the questions generally hostile?
Yes, which is good because it means that I've challenged real deep beliefs and that they are now challenging me with the things that come into their mind. And of course, all the challenges are the same, which I've often commented on. All the challenges I get are, but what about the poor? Okay, so I answer that one. But what about those poor? And okay, I answer that. And what about those poor? It's so and I often say to them, just partially to shock them, but partially because there's a point here. Why do you care? Right? What is it that motivates the question? I mean, I care about the poor, and I think capitalism is the best system, hands down, no question, for the poor. But why do you care about the poor? Why don't you care primarily about what the system would do to your life? Why isn't that your first thought? And I guess this is the moral training, unfortunately, that we give our kids. We give our kids the moral training to think of others always first. But I would like to see kids thinking, how would I live under a system like this? What would life for me be like? And then ask about the poor. I mean, I'm not saying don't get there. But it shouldn't be the first thing that everybody wants to ask, right? And that you're never satisfied with the answer because it's not the answer you're expecting to get. And this goes to the point you asked, what do we do about it? And this is where I'm most controversial even with allies. I mean, even with conservatives and certainly with libertarians who might be allies on some issues. This is where the kind of the rubber hits the road. I believe in rational self-interest. I believe that the moral purpose of life is to make the most of your life, is to live the best life that you can live for yourself. It's the achievement of happiness is the greatest moral achievement, or achievement of a complete life as a human being. Really, to live fully is that's it. And everything else, like what about the poor, should fit into that. But the first question should always be, how does this affect me? Is my life going to be better under this system or that system? Can I flourish? Do I have more opportunities? Can I do more things? Can I experience more art? What does it do to my life as a human being, given the kind of kind of animal we are, conceptual being, with all the wonders that are available to us in the world? That's what I think is important. And then part of that is how you treat other people, but that's a derivative. It's not the primary. I want to treat other people well because they're other people. They create enormous value that I benefit from, and I live in a society. I live with other people. Love is what's more selfish, if we want to use that term. What's more self-interested than love, right? I love you because you make me feel great about the world, right? So until we can, I often tell my libertarian, particularly friends, what we need is a moral revolution. The economic political revolution will come if we have the moral revolution. But if we don't have the moral revolution, I fear that we will never have the political economic revolution, because even if you'll achieve a few things, you'll always drift backwards.
Okay, so first of all, where did this attitude come from? This almost, well, we've now got pathological altruism, haven't we?
Yes.
But altruism generally. But is it Christianity or is it religion generally?
I think certainly Christianity, because it's more in Christianity than it is in Judaism. Judaism has a lot less of it.
Oh, does it?
And yes, I mean, Judaism is much more concerned about I think, individual happiness. But Christianity really gets it, right? And it solidifies it and establishes a whole system about it. At the end of the day, Jesus is on a cross, dying the most horrific death imaginable for sins he didn't commit, for sins all of us committed. Now, what an injustice that is. That to me is horrific.
Yeah.
Why would I want to die? Why should anybody die? For something they didn't do, right? Justice demands the opposite. Justice demands that you get treated the way you deserve as an individual, and yet he's not treated as an individual. So every time I see a cross, I think, what we're worshiping here is the idea that the most noble thing we can do in life is sacrifice and die for not because we deserve to die, but because other people have done something wrong.
Yeah.
But I don't think it started there. Obviously, Christianity capitalized on something that already existed, and I think, look, from the beginning of time, the tribal leader and the witch doctor schemed together to figure out how to control all these individuals who were in the tribe and trying to do their own thing. And the best way to control them is to say, look, your life is meaningless as an individual. What matters is the tribe. What matters is the group. What matters are other people. How do we know this? Because the witch doctors commune with the spirits, and the spirits have told him, and this is the only way to know the truth, because there is no other way. And how do we know what's good for the tribe? Because nobody here actually can represent the tribe. Well, that's what my job is. I'm the tribal leader, and I commune with the spirit of the tribe to tell what is right for the tribe, and I use the witch doctor to help me do that. And together, you must follow our orders. You must do it. So altruism is a great way to control people. If I tell you your life is not yours, your happiness is not important. What's important is their happiness, and I'm the only one who knows what causes them to be happy.
Yeah.
And it's not any particular one of them, because none of them are supposed to be happy either, because they're supposed to sacrifice for the rest of our tribe. So nobody's ever really happy. Then it establishes me in a position of power, and I get to control everything that happens. And so, and if you think about it, what does Hitler say, right? Hitler says, you must all sacrifice for the Aryan people. What is good for the Aryan people? Well, you guys don't know what's good for the Aryan people. We need somebody to commune with the world of spirits, to commune with the Aryan people, to tell you what's good for the Aryan people. Yeah. That's why we need a dictator. And communism is the same thing. Why do we need a dictator in communism? Because how do we know what's good for the proletarian? The proletarian can't talk. Yeah. The proletarian don't have a voice. We can't have elections because it's not a majority thing. It's what's really good for the proletarian. Well, we need somebody, a philosopher king. This is all kind of institutionalized by Plato. We need a philosopher king to tell us what's good for the proletarian. Well, Lenin or Stalin or whoever, he's the philosopher king, and he'll let you know what's good for the proletarian. And then you can sacrifice for the proletarian. So it's a mechanism, whether the church did it or secular dictators have done it throughout the ages. There's always a witch doctor element to it, so there's always a religious element to it. The same with fascism and communism. There's a religious element there. to control people, and it's always been the case. And altruism is probably the greatest gimmick invented for exactly that. And what was crushed, what's always been crushed, is kind of the Aristotelian individualism, the idea that we all have the capacity to know the truth. We don't need a philosopher king to tell us what's true. We have reason. Everybody has it. And we should treat people as thinking individual human beings. And the only way to change their mind is to convince them using reason. Other than that, what they do is none of our business. We should leave them alone.
So what you describe is very familiar. I was fishing yesterday, and I was with a bunch of people, and it's these people. Some I had met, some I hadn't met. Nice people that I great time fishing with and stuff, and in the pub.
Good.
But when it came to talking about politics, and they sort of discovered where I'm coming from politically, their first reaction was, "You don't really believe this. You're only saying this stuff to be a provocateur. Nobody could possibly believe this." And one man confided to me. He said, "Yeah, well, even though it's not in my own interests," this is just classic your argument. He said, "Even though it's not in my interests, I'll always vote Labour because I care about the poor." And I think these are probably quite representative of a lot of people out there.
Yeah.
Now, which is the second part of my question to you, which is, you said we need a philosophical revolution, a moral revolution.
Moral revolution, yeah.
Not everyone's going to buy into objectivism. It's quite out there, Yaron.
Well, I know, but so is any ideology at the beginning, and it takes a long time. And the more radical the ideology is, the longer time it takes. So I'm in this not for tomorrow, but I really am in this for decades. I think it's going to take generations before basically mankind's ready for it. Before we can give up on these ancient ideas that still have a stranglehold on us. But it's education. There are no shortcuts. I really don't believe there are shortcuts. Yes, you can improve things for a little while. I'll give you an example. Chile is this wonderful country in South America. It used to be the poorest country in Latin America on a per capita GDP basis, and today it's the richest country in Latin America. And yet, as it got richer and as it got more successful, and it got rich and successful for one simple reason: it adopted, almost by accident, because this dictator, he was so desperate that he handed the economy over to a bunch of people who studied in Chicago under Milton Friedman, right? The Chicago boys.
Yeah.
And they turned to capitalism, and they freed up the economy, and they became rich.
When did this happen?
Well, he turned the economy over in the very early 80s.
Yeah.
And over the last 20 years, and then he stopped being. He actually had an election to decide whether he should stay as a dictator or not, and the people voted against him, and he walked away, and they established a democracy. And so for a while, this was going, and everybody was happy, and everybody voted for good policies, and they got freer and freer and freer, and it got richer and richer and richer.
Yeah.
And then they got to a point, and they said, "Oh, but we still have poor." Now, the poor...
What about the poor, yeah?
The poor were a lot richer than they used to be. A lot richer than they used to be. But the gap between the poor and the rich had expanded, even though the poor had gotten richer.
Yeah.
So then they vote for a couple of socialists, and for 2 terms, the socialists ruled over Chile, and now she was a disaster, so they've turned back to a kind of a more market-friendly president. But what happens is, and this happened in the United States, we had Ronald Reagan, but there was no revolution. There was no Ronald Reagan revolution. He freed up the economy, did some good things, and the economy did well. And then Bill Clinton, didn't really change anything. But then we got to Bush, and Bush reversed a lot of what Reagan did, and there we are back to a huge state. Government spending went through the roof under George Bush, even if you take out all the military spending. And then we got Obama, and now we've got Trump. So unless you challenge the fundamental beliefs, yes, you can have a president or you can have a political party that for a while makes a difference. Certainly in the UK, I think more than in America, Margaret Thatcher had a profound impact on this country, a profound impact on the UK, and it's benefited from it. But of course, people here now hate Margaret Thatcher. It's stunning to me how many people, kind of Brits, really dislike her when she's the reason we're so rich here in London. I mean, it's amazing to me. But there's always going to be this backlash against the left, and then the left will come and they'll screw it up, and then the right will come and they'll tinker a little bit and things. But we're not going to get a sustained improvement. We're not going to get this over many, many years, over generations, unless we rethink our fundamental.
Well, we're
beliefs.
totally not, because even under Reagan, government spending.
Yeah, Reagan was a failure when it came to government spending.
Yeah,
and when it came to a number of different things. I mean, I think Reagan gets too much credit for the good stuff. I mean, even deregulation. The funny thing is, people don't know this historically. Most of the important deregulation happened under Jimmy Carter. And people don't even know this. So airline deregulation, trucking deregulation, financial deregulation, all of that happened under Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan benefited from it because he came right after, and just as all this was taking off. But yes, I mean, you don't get cuts in spending, which is what really matters. What really matters when it comes to politics is how much money does the government spend. That is the proxy for how much power they have and how much influence they have over the economy.
I think my take-home of this podcast is going to be My Hero, Jimmy Carter by Yaron Brook.
No, please.
But it's true.
He did good things. He did some good things.
Isn't that interesting, actually? That is, we think of him as the idiot peanut farmer
and
who went and cocked up with the Iranian hostages, and actually he was a deregulator. Who knew that?
He had some decent economic advisors, and the economy in the U.S., people forget this again because the left has brainwashed us with the alternative history. The 1970s were an awful period. Awful in I remember England in the 1970s.
Great music, though. You can't... Led Zeppelin,
yes,
early Neil Young.
Great music. We grew up on that music. It was no question. I'm a Pink Floyd fan.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
But then if you look at the United States, the 1970s were a disaster, stagflation, and they had run out of kind of socialist remedies, and what was left was, well, let's try this deregulation thing, and it worked. And of course, nobody learns from that. But yes, it was Jimmy Carter, I think, by default doing it, not because he intended to, because he handed some stuff over. He had a Democratic Congress, and they still voted for it.
I've got to ask you this. I know we're going to disagree on this because of what you've hinted earlier. I'm very worried. I think almost the biggest. China. Islam, fundamentalist Islam. I think one of the biggest menaces to our worldview and actually to Western civilization is the power of Silicon Valley, which is dominated by leftists. Now, what do we do? I mean, you don't believe in breaking up these cartels. So how do we escape their stranglehold?
I don't believe they're cartels. I mean, I really don't think they're cartels, and I don't think they're monopolies. Look,
they're de facto cartels, whether they're intentionally cartels, but
well,
they control
ideologically, that's true. There's a certain mindset in Silicon Valley which they all share, and so they all act in unison because they all basically are afraid to be left behind. So if somebody deplatforms. What's his name?
Alex Jones.
Then everybody does because it's the cool thing to do in Silicon Valley, and you don't want to be uncool. My view is that using the state to do anything here is going to have immense damage down the road. I mean, you're giving the state more power to decide when there's a monopoly over intellectual ideas and when there isn't. When the left gets in and decides that talk radio in America is way too right-wing, and what we need is to break up, Rush Limbaugh, and he can only broadcast once a week. He can't broadcast 5 days a week. And he doesn't allow leftists on his show, which he shouldn't, right? Because maybe he should be forced to interview a leftist once in a while. Once you get the government into the business of deciding who is manipulating ideas how, the marketplace should decide. We don't like it, I don't know. Let's get together. Let's get Peter Thiel and a few other kind of better pro-free market entrepreneurs and create a competitor to some of these ventures. I mean, that's what we should believe in as capitalists. Let's create a better mousetrap. Look, much worse than Silicon Valley. 100 times worse than Silicon Valley. Our universities. I mean, you're worried about the leftism in Silicon Valley. The universities are 90-something% left, right?
Yeah.
And particularly in the humanities. And I've seen the statistics. They're mind-numbing. I mean, they were bad 30 years ago, but they're much worse today.
Yeah.
What are you going to do there? You're going to force a particular point of view into the universities, and what is that point of view? Is it conservatism? Is it libertarianism? Is it just centrism? And to me, the reason the other question you have to ask is, why is Silicon Valley so uniformly leftist?
Yes.
And I think that's the more interesting question. That's what we should really be challenged with. Why are these really, really smart people, who are the most productive people in the entire world today, they're really creating economic growth in the United States is being driven by Silicon Valley today. I mean, that's whatever the GDP numbers are, it's predominantly coming out of Silicon Valley. It's why California survives in spite of its socialist policies.
Yes.
why are these incredibly productive, smart people leftists? And I think there's a lot of soul searching that the right has to do to figure out how they lost these people, because they lost these people. The previous generation of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs were not this leftist. The founder. I don't believe Steve Jobs was really a leftist. Larry Ellison is a libertarian. A lot of these people were never radically left as they are today. And I think the reason is that the right is dramatically screwed up. I mean, my view is that the big screw up the right has made in America is its affiliation with the religious right. And if you have candidates in the Republican Party, and they're asked, "What is your view of evolution?" and not one of them will say, "I believe evolution is a legitimate scientific view." Not one of them. They'll either say, "I don't want to answer," or they'll say, "Well, I believe that God created man," whatever. Then nobody who's got an engineering degree and who takes his belief in science and belief in engineering is going to support, and what is going to support you. And as a consequence, they lump them all together. These religious fanatics. Yeah, capitalism. That's from the religious right, which is tragic. And you'd think they would be better thinkers than that, but that is what's happening. It's really. It's the fact that the right tries to cultivate, the worst elements in American society, or the most backward elements in American society, and that it is rejecting science explicitly, and that turns Silicon Valley off from them. Now, I'm not saying that's an excuse for them to be doing what they're doing. I don't think what they're doing is good. But I think the right bears quite a bit of responsibility for alienating these really smart people, and we should change. I mean, I remember somebody asked me to advise Ted Cruz before the California primary, and it turned out that he withdrew from the race before we got to California because Donald Trump had already won it. But they said no, and I said, look, Ted Cruz, Ted Cruz doesn't want to hear from me. And I said, no, we've talked to them. They want to talk to you. They want to get a sense of what could he do to win California. And what I was going to tell him was, you're going to have to take back a lot of what you've said on the campaign trail. You have so groveled before the evangelicals, to no avail, because they all voted for Donald Trump, not for you. But you have so groveled before them. You have so demeaned yourself and the ideas of science and progress and the modern world that unless you do a real 180-degree turn, and you're not going to get the vote of even the better people in Silicon Valley. They're just not going to vote for you. No, I think intervening in Silicon Valley now in the name of so-called free speech is going to be the worst thing for free speech possible. It will destroy free speech in America. And these companies are not censoring because only the government can censor, and by the government stepping in and telling them what they can and cannot produce, or breaking them up because they don't like what they're saying, is the worst kind of censorship. The best thing we can do is create competitive alternatives. If the right has 50% of the voters in the United States, then they should be able to create a real competitor to Facebook.
We'll talk a bit more about this in the next section. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Yaron Brook. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Tonight with Joel Pollack and Rebecca Mansour.
The real thing that the left is angry about is they're like, how could you allow these Russian memes? Somebody saw a meme and then they decided they had to vote for Trump. Or it must have been fake news. And by fake news, they mean conservative websites. Come on. But this is what the left thinks. Fake news. And by fake news, what they mean is shut down Breitbart.
Breitbart News Tonight. Weeknights starting at 9 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Yaron Brook. Yaron, I did know that was going to be your line. Yeah. And the vibe, you're a very, very impressive person. I don't want to...
thank you.
You are. And I think that the actual solution to the world's problems is if you could somehow... Have you seen The Boys from Brazil? How you could... If you could clone... In a nice way, you could be like a nice Hitler. You could... If we could clone lots of you and have you going... Because clearly this is the message you have is a good one. I cannot share your faith that libertarian, whatever you want, objectivist ideas are enough. And in the same way, the market, I wonder, Peter Thiel's shown no interest in creating the alternative to...
I'm not sure. We'll see.
Oh,
I don't want to speak out of turn, but
okay.
There are discussions, there are debates.
Oh, okay.
There's things going on in the background.
I see.
So I'm not sure Peter will do anything, but there are people out there certainly having discussions about this and looking at the possibilities and what would be involved. Look, I have a very, very positive view of human beings. I'm an optimist when it comes to individual human beings. And I look at the world around us and I see this amazing beauty, and I see human creations everywhere I look, and there was a mind behind everything, whether it's that computer on the desk or whether it's the amazing restaurants down the street. I mean, we talked about the fact that we're both foodies. I mean, wow! I mean, what people can do with simple ingredients is just fantastic, and so I believe in human ingenuity. I believe in the human mind. My heroes, I have to say, and I get a lot of flack for this, my heroes are the people in Silicon Valley, in spite of their politics, because they make my life better every single day, and I can't imagine life without the products that they build and the products they create. So I'm a little in awe of them because I think they're such great human beings. On
one level.
Well, but on the important level. To me, what you do with your mind in producing and trading with people and innovating is far more important than politics. At the end of the day, I mean, I wish we weren't that enamored with politics, because I wish politics was less intervening in our lives. Politics is important, but what you do with your own life, what you produce, what you create. Like, I don't care about Michelangelo's politics. For all I know, Michelangelo, and I know his politics were terrible. He was very religious and he was miserable, unfortunately. But when I stand in front of David, I don't care about his politics. Wow, this man produced something that inspires me, in unbelievable ways. And the same is true of Steve Jobs, and the same is true of many of these people in Silicon Valley. They inspire me. So, and to me, that's much more important than the politics. We need to fight the politics. But as I said, I think politics are a derivative from morality. And what's more moral than taking your life seriously, as I think all these people in Silicon Valley do, producing and creating and trading with other people for the mutual benefit in win-win relationships. Think of Amazon. What would life be like without Amazon? Particularly living in Puerto Rico, which I do now, I rely on Amazon for a lot of basic stuff I can't buy in the supermarket. So, and it's a beautiful, amazing thing. So, I believe if we appeal to people's virtue, if we appeal to the positive, if we appeal to them wanting to be happy, right? To their wanting to be successful, then I think we can win. It's going to take a long time. It's not easy, but I think we can win. If we appeal to the worst in them, if we condemn the most productive in our society, then we lose.
There's a book I commend to you. It would depress you greatly. Have you heard of Richard Legutko?
No.
He's a Polish academic MEP. Who recognizes the parallels between liberal democracy and communism. He said, I grew up in communism, and I look at liberal democracy, and when the wall came down, suddenly we were exposed, and lo, it's just like, he doesn't use this phrase, but this is my phrase, it's like communism without the bread queues. It's the same controlling mentality.
There's a truth there, right? I mean, majorities, I think Ayn Rand called, maybe it's Madison who called, democracy, the rule of the gang, the rule of the majority is just it can be just as authoritarian. Although, I was at a celebration of the fall of the Berlin Wall. When was it? 25-year anniversary, so a couple of years ago, and it was in Berlin, and they had Václav Klaus from
he's good.
Yeah, he's sometimes good, and they had this woman who was a freedom fighter in Eastern Germany and everything. And then it had me, and the three of us were speakers. And Václav gets up there and he says, oh, it's getting worse than communism. Look at all these isms, feminism, this ism, that ism. And the woman, I fought for freedom, and look what we have today. And the organizer came up to me and said, this is supposed to be a celebration of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Can you be a little positive? And I said, look, guys, this isn't communism. Give me a break. I mean, look at outside. Look at the kind of world you're living in. Look at the fact that you can say these things right now.
Yeah, now.
Well, yeah,
give it time.
Okay. Yeah, I know. The pessimist in you.
Yeah.
But But we can talk about these things and we can argue about them, but look at the quality of life and the standard of living. You forget what communism was really like. So yes, liberal democracy is bad, and I'm not a believer generally in democracy qua majority rule. This is why I think the founders of America were such geniuses in that they created a system, a constitutional republic, which guarded everything they did was to guard us against the majority.
They were great.
To guard us against the majority.
They were the best of England. They came out there.
Absolutely. And of course they took English and French ideas. I mean, it's the Enlightenment. They are. I mean, the creation of America is the great achievement of the Enlightenment. That it is the pinnacle of the Enlightenment. It's John Locke and all in the French and Scottish, primarily Scottish Enlightenment of that period, and it all manifested itself in the creation of the United States of America. And it's amazing. And I often think that what we're really trying to do is save the Enlightenment, right? So that's and I know we'll probably disagree on this, and I know most of my friends disagree with this. I think Ayn Rand is an Enlightenment thinker, and to a large extent completes or fills in a lot of what the Enlightenment missed out on, and she provides the answers to those who attack the Enlightenment, the Germans who come afterwards, and some of the other philosophers. So this is one continuation, and our job is really to save those thinkers, to save those ideas, the ideas of reason, of science, and of individualism. I mean, that's what the Enlightenment boils down to, and capitalism is just a product of reason and individualism.
I'm going to not ask you about Islam because I really want you back on the podcast. I think people are going to be, despite because some people are going to be saying he doesn't like Trump. I'm not sure I can deal with that. But I think you will have swayed many people and they will have fallen in love with you.
And I think they'll find my views on Islam interesting.
Well, of course they will. I know, of course they will. But I want to say that for another podcast. I want to find a bit more about you.
Absolutely.
So, you grew up in Israel?
I did. Grew up in Israel.
And your parents were socialists?
Yes, as everybody was in Israel at the time. So I grew up in a period of Israel where the Labour Party won every election, where everybody around me was a socialist. It was unimaginable and unknowable to be anything else. You just didn't know of it. I spent 2 years actually in England when I was very little, in the 1960s, actually in Hackney. I went to Hackney Jewish Day School.
Okay.
That's where I became an atheist. And then I spent 2 years in America. And I have to say, back then I hated America. It lacked all the things I loved about Israel, the collectivism, the tribalism.
Oh, so you bought into it for a while?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Hook, line, and sinker. I was a socialist. Right? I remember arguing in America with all my American friends about the virtues of socialism.
So how old were you at this stage?
I was 14, 15.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And then one day I was with a friend and we were arguing about something and he was spouting these pro-market capitalist ideas. And I said, where are you getting this nonsense from? And he said, you got to read this book. And he handed me a copy of Atlas Shrugged. And that was 1977. I was 16. And it was also the first year where the Labour Party lost in Israel. Begin came to power. And I fought the book. I disagreed with everything. I did not want to accept anything she said. It was turning my world literally upside down. I was the kind of kid who grew up in Israel looking for the grenade I could jump on so I could sacrifice my life for the tribe, for the I was a patriot. I was going to be in the special forces. That was my life.
You'd have been very good at it.
And I was in the Israeli army and I was good at it, but Ayn Rand completely, I'd throw the book on the wall. I would argue. I would yell. But in the end, she won, and she convinced me. And the rest is history, in a sense. I went on to read everything else she wrote, and spent 3 years in the Israeli army.
Did you enjoy that?
No. It was mainly boring. It was boring. The best thing out of it, and I guess the reason I don't actually regret it, is I met my wife in the Israeli army. We were in the same units in military intelligence during a war so it was.
During a war, which one was that?
It was 1982, the war in Lebanon. So,
okay. So did you get some access to some interesting intelligence stuff?
Absolutely. A lot of cool intelligence stuff, and we were very involved in the Israeli invasion into Lebanon and the destruction of the Palestinian terrorist bases over there and the whole Palestinian terrorist infrastructure that was permeated southern Lebanon all the way into Beirut. And I spent a little time in Beirut as part of the intelligence gathering mission and traveled around Lebanon to see kind of what we'd identified was whether the intelligence was right. So it was interesting. The war was interesting, but of course it's sad when you have to have a war to make it interesting. But I think it was a just war, and Israel did the right thing in going into Lebanon. Unfortunately, they didn't leave fast enough, but they should have left very quickly. People don't learn from history about wars, but again, that's probably a discussion about Islam and about war.
No, go on. Now you said rather plaintively that my views on Islam are quite interesting. People are going to be going, how is he not going to ask him his views on Islam? So go on. Tell me your views on Islam.
Well, look, my views on Islam as a religion is of all the religions, it's the one that has been least secularized, and therefore it's the one that's most evil. And it's the most primitive, it's the most barbaric, it's still Dark Ages. It's where Christianity and Judaism were 1,000 years ago or more. Luckily, Christianity and Judaism went through a secularization. The prime responsibility of that is Aristotle, the discovery of Aristotle by Thomas Aquinas, who brought it into the Catholic Church and really changed the West. And we had a Renaissance and we had Enlightenment, and that completely changed everything. Islam had that for a very brief period of time, really in the beginning of Islam, about 900 to 1100. And unfortunately abandoned Aristotle, abandoned the libraries. I mean, there's a golden era of Islam, which is quite amazing.
Do we know why it did that? What happened?
The greatest philosopher, it's all about ideas and it's all about philosophy. Philosophers are the most powerful people in the world. So during this golden age of Islam, they had discovered Aristotle, they translated, they had the biggest libraries in the world were in Baghdad, the most amazing libraries. And the biggest debate within the Islamic world in terms of philosophical debate is what do we do with faith versus reason? Because Aristotle's teaching us reason, but Islam teaches us faith, and how do we do it? And they try to integrate it, and they try to mesh it, and they try to deal with it. But it was always a point of concern, just like it was with Aquinas and the Catholic Church. So at around 1200, I can't remember the exact date, there was the greatest philosopher of the time. His name was Al-Ghazali. He was struggling with this debate, and he landed up, this is a true story, he landed up going into the desert to meditate about this issue. And he spent about 10 years away from Baghdad and away from civilization. And he returned, and he said, I've got the answer. And the answer is we have to abandon reason. And we have to dedicate ourselves to Islam and dedicate ourselves to faith. And until we do that, we cannot return to greatness. And within a generation, all the libraries in Baghdad are burnt to the ground. They disappear. They literally are gone. Now, later, about 50 years later, the Mongols invade and they destroy Baghdad and they destroy that whole. But all the libraries in the Middle East are gone. The last remnant of the Islamic Golden Age is in Spain, in Cordoba and Seville, and those great libraries in Spain. And they're not destroyed. His ideas do not travel to Spain. They just influence the Middle East. And when the Christians invade Spain and they conquer and they take those libraries, they discover all these writings. And they immediately take the books to Paris, where they're translated from Arabic into Latin. So they don't read Aristotle in original Greek. They read him in Latin translated from Arabic, which was translated from the Greek. And I think, and to a large extent, that changes civilization. So you could say the Arabs save civilization because they save all those Greek amazing books. And of course, you had great Arab and Jewish philosophers at the time who were very Aristotelian. Maimonides is the great Jewish philosopher who's very influenced by Aristotle, and he's in Spain during this period. But then once the Christians take over, they take the libraries and they absorb that knowledge into Christianity, which ultimately leads to the secularization of Christianity. And at the same time, the Muslims take many, many steps backwards and become back to their primitive roots. And they're still, unfortunately, the sad thing is they're still there. And every attempt they make to break out of those primitive roots, we in the West discourage it. So the best example of this is in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, rich Arabs from Egypt and Syria and Iraq would send their kids to study in the West because they thought the West is richer, it's better, they have great ideas, they'll bring them back. What did these kids study when they went to German universities and French universities and unfortunately British universities? Well, they came back with two ideas. They came back with socialism and fascism. And if you look at the Ba'ath Party, which is a Syrian and Iraqi, the secular, the pro-Western, they're all fascists and socialists. So these fascists and socialists destroyed the Arab world, And who gets blamed for that? Well, the West does, because they learned these ideas in the West. They didn't come out of the Middle East. And even today, you have this massive Muslim immigration coming into the West. And the West is not telling these Muslim immigrants, all right, time to abandon your primitive, barbaric ideas and adopt ours, because ours are superior, and here's a list, free speech, women have equal rights, da-da-da-da-da. No, we tell them, multiculturalism, all cultures are equal. Your barbaric culture is just as good as our wonderful culture. And again, we're destroying their opportunity. This is an opportunity for them.
I like that take on it. Yes, because that's almost the altruistic take, you might say.
Yes, well, I think altruism is behind it. Multiculturalism is a product of altruism. It's a product of the lack of self-confidence. It's a product of the lack of self-interest of the West. But then there's also the question, certainly since 9/11, but I believe since November 4th, 1979, when the American embassy was taken by Khomeini, that we're at war with a certain faction of the Islamists. So within the Muslim world, there's a faction. We can call it jihadis. We can call it Islamic totalitarians. A variety of different names to it. And we're at war with them. Now, this is the most pathetically fought war in all of human history, because we in the West don't like to kill anybody when we go to war. We like to provide them with sewers and build them roads, and we like to bring them democracy. But God forbid we actually defeat them and crush them and actually teach them a lesson. So I was a huge critic of George Bush after 9/11, because I thought he was a wimp, and I thought the United States had the wrong response. It invaded the wrong countries. It penalized the wrong people, and he never, except for 1 week during his entire presidency, he refused to affiliate the terrorists with Islam. He called them terrorists, and there was a war on terrorism instead of a war on Islamic terrorism or a war against totalitarian Islam. He called them terrorists, which is one of the great feats of cowardice in all of human history. And I'll give Donald Trump credit. He is the first to identify the terrorists as Islamic, although he also does that at the same time as going to dance with the propagators of these ideas in Saudi Arabia. So he gets only half credit for me. So
but hold on. A brief praise for Trump. The Warsaw speech. His Warsaw speech was great.
No, the Warsaw speech was terrible.
I loved the Warsaw speech.
It was one of my worst.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, no.
I actually did a whole podcast analyzing his Warsaw speech.
Okay.
Because he attributes what Western values are. He attributes to all the wrong things. It's basically a kind of a pro-collectivism, family values kind of soppy, conservative. It was awful. It was perfect for the Poles because of where Poland is right now. Right. And I think he wanted to emphasize religion and family and all the conservative virtues that supposedly. But it messed up.
Family is important.
Sure, it's important, but it's not what makes the West the West. Muslims have families. Everybody has families. What makes the West the West, again, is reason and individualism and science and technology and capitalism. And none of those things ever make anybody's speeches, not just Donald Trump, but anybody's speeches, and certainly not even George Bush. But look, if I were president on 9/11, the first thing you would do is say, okay, Islamic terrorists attacked us. Who funds them? Who supports them? Who's the ideological mind behind them? Who's the spirit that animated the terrorists? And I'd make a list. And number one on the list would have to be, Al-Qaeda. Okay, Al-Qaeda. But who animates Al-Qaeda? Who funds Al-Qaeda? Where do they get their money from? Well, it has to be Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And right above or right under it, depends how you want to do it, is Iran. And then you have to list Al-Qaeda and Hamas and Hezbollah and all the different terrorist organizations that are all dedicated to the same cause, Muslim Brotherhood. And then you have to say, okay, we're at war with all of these people, starting with the Saudis and the Iranians, not the Iraqis and the Afghans.
Yes.
And that would have changed everything. Because instead of hugging the Prince of Saudi Arabia, which he did 3 weeks after, instead of inviting Muslims to celebrate the Ramadan in the White House 3 weeks after 9/11, the whole orientation would have been different. You go after them, you crush them, you defeat them, you tell them, you want war with us? All right, we can do this, but you will die and you will be destroyed because we're much more powerful than you and you are primitive and barbaric. We can't win a war against people in caves. That's pretty sad. So even though I don't like Donald Trump, I'm a lot less politically correct than he is.
I think he's much more your man than you're prepared to admit, or even mentally acknowledge. Yeah. But look, That has been a great podcast. I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad I asked you the Islam question. And you've got to come back.
I'd love to come
You've
back.
so got
Love
to come
to come
back.
back.
You're listening to
Love
the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Yaron Brook. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow.
Why did we see some of the Republican kissing of Mark Zuckerberg that was taking place?
I called it kissing the ring because I felt like every single person practically had to kiss the ring of this guy, who wants to do nothing except get all those people out of office. So, bizarre behavior from the Republicans.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays at 6 a.m. Eastern on Sirius XM Patriot 125.